Hey folks, Stewart here. I have been to the top of that mountain testing this DJI Air 3. What a time I've had. It's not exactly what I was expecting. I'll tell you this, I've crashed it already, but we're back up in the air. Let's have a chat about it. Look at this shot. It does not look like it was filmed on a drone, does it? Nor does this one, but it was. Everything you see here is filmed on a drone. We have manual focus, shallow depth of field, big wide angles, 70mm compression here, as you can see. There's so much potential in this drone. It's like a camera crew in your pocket, and I don't think that's fully understood yet, the creative opportunity. So, let's get into that now. Hey folks, it's so good to be back in the studio talking to you about these amazing flying cameras. Today we are focusing on the Air 3, but reference will be made to the Mini 4 Pro and the Mavic 3 Pro. If you need a specification recap, grab our drone comparison chart in the link below, because we're going to be focusing on real-world feedback. I have pushed this drone to the limit, both physically in terms of what it can achieve in the air and in terms of what that camera can achieve. So I think we've got a lot to add to the conversation today. Timestamps below if you want to jump to anything in particular. Let's get stuck in. As you of course know, the Air 3 has two cameras, which is not a new development with DJI drones, but at this price point it most certainly is. And let me tell you, the creative opportunity that 70mm lens gives you is tremendous. I'm out flying by myself. It's as if I've got a camera operator with a gimbal and a 70mm portrait lens following me around doing B-roll shots. You can set this thing to manual focus, get shallow depth of field, close-ups on details. It is so cool, not to mention the parallax effects that you can get with bigger landscapes if you create depth in your shots. There's a lot to learn here and a lot to unpack. Too much for this video, but stay tuned because we're going to get into that in more detail. The other thing that really tickled my fancy with this two-camera setup is that with the exception of the different aperture and of course the focal length, everything else is the same. So from the hardware side with the same sensor all the way down to the software, we get the same intelligent flight modes, we get the same frame rates, resolutions, we get the same color profiles. So there's no downside to switching between those cameras. There's no hesitation in terms of thinking, I really want to do a 70mm shot, but I know the picture quality is not as good. It's the same. The user experience is absolutely fantastic. The 4K image quality from both cameras is very good, and if you're buying a fairly expensive drone like this, I would certainly recommend you shoot the 10-bit color profile, D-Log-M. In terms of picture quality, we get maximum quality up to 60 frames per second. I wouldn't hesitate to use any of those slow motion frame rates. At 100 frames per second, I would say there's a slight deterioration in quality. It's visible in the shadows, but not enough that would stop me from using it. So we have just a full spectrum of frame rates there that we can use without any reservation. There's also 200 frames per second at 1080p. There is a drop off in quality. It's usable if you can find a genuine purpose for 200 frames per second. Personally, more often than not, we find that 50 frames per second is the sweet spot. It's enough slow motion to make things look a little bit cool, but without killing all the motion that you've just put into your drone maneuver, for example, because obviously the slower things get, the less you're going to see your drone move. The image quality from the 24mm lens is lovely for those wide-angle drone shots. 1/1.3 inch sensor is smaller than the 1-inch sensor that came on the Air 2S. In terms of light gathering capability, that's pretty much offset by the fact we have a f1.7 lens on the Air 3 versus an f2.8 on the Air 2S, so that's all a bit of a wash, to be honest with you. It's the picture quality on the 70mm lens that gets me super excited. With a 3-meter minimum focusing distance, if you get close to subjects, you get shallow depth of field. When have we ever talked about shallow depth of field with drones before? It looks amazing if you're filming subjects. This gives you a tremendous new repertoire of shots that you can introduce into your portfolio of drone capabilities. You can mix up the footage and create much more interesting content. Now, in terms of the quality of that camera, we can get a 2x digital zoom on that 70mm lens, crop in digitally, and the quality is still really, really good. You'd need to squint to tell the difference and say that that was a digital zoom. You can actually go into 9x as well, and it still looks quite good. As long as your focus is perfect, you need to learn to use autofocus, then switch it to manual focus so the focus doesn't hunt in the middle of that shot. You can get shots that just don't look like they're shot on a drone. And like I say, if you're coming at this from a drone perspective and you've never really played around with longer focal lengths, you've got a whole world of excitement and discovery ahead of you. Omnidirectional obstacle avoidance, very, very helpful. Not foolproof, I managed to crash it, of course, into tree branches in some groovy cruise control maneuvers. That's a topic for another day. Oh, the creative opportunity that comes with that. But nonetheless, watch out for fine branches and such like. You can still overcome the omnidirectional obstacle avoidance, but in a more regular scenario, yes, it's going to save your bacon, especially if you're doing point of interest maneuvers with the intelligent flight modes and it's flying sideways. It's going to help you a lot. Speaking of intelligent flight modes, I'm delighted that all 3 intelligent flight modes work across both cameras, all frame rates up to 200 frames per second. You can just play around with all these combinations. It's amazing. In terms of performance, a little bit of color contrast definitely helps the software lock on to the subject. If you're blending in with your background, it's not going to work out so well. My favorite intelligent flight modes by far are Spotlight and Point of Interest. With just a little bit of forward planning, you can use those 2 intelligent flight modes to create storytelling shots that have some kind of purpose, some kind of design behind them to reveal new parts of the frame and keep the viewer watching, drag them into that scene. That's what's going to separate you from everyone else that has a drone. In terms of your first port of call to learn this stuff, please do download our free ebook From Drone Zero to Drone Hero, 37 tips to get you flying like a filmmaker. And if you're new to this channel, you might not have heard us talk about our 9-hour drone cinematography masterclass. Tremendous body of work, all updated, beautifully filmed. You need to look at that course if you're remotely interested in this kind of stuff. 30-day money-back guarantee, so there's no downside in checking it out. In terms of active track, you need to understand its limitations a little bit. It's perfect for following fast-moving subjects, so a car, or you on a bike, or you running, for example. Where it falls down a little bit is slow walking. It can get a little bit erratic. It'll track you, but the drone starts getting a little bit crazy trying to figure out where to go next. The little dial where you can pick the position of the drone relative to the subject, again, that's going to work quite well for fast-moving subjects that are clearly defined on the screen, but you just kind of pottering about, it's not so good. I would go to Spotlight or Point of Interest in that scenario. If your subject is moving fairly quickly in the frame or your drone is moving fairly quickly, you're going to need ND filters to get the shutter speed down to double the frame rate so you get the motion blur the eye is accustomed to seeing when watching cinematic footage. However, there is a slight difference in the aperture between these 2 cameras, so the same ND filter is not going to work for both lenses. A little pro tip for buying Air 3 NDs: get the split NDs from Freewell. They have different opacity glass for the 2 lenses, and that balances out the exposure implications of having 2 different apertures on those 2 cameras. By contrast, DJI's own NDs and those of other manufacturers have a single piece of glass that does not help you with that exposure shift, so you're going to be on the ISO or the shutter to try and compensate for that if you're switching between the 2 cameras, which you don't really want to be doing. Another scenario where a variable aperture is super useful is just before sunset. It's a change in lighting conditions. In one situation, I knew it was getting dark fast. I didn't want to have to land the drone after 5 minutes to switch out the ND, so I couldn't be bothered, and I sent the drone up without an ND. I knew that I wasn't going to be flying close to things. There shouldn't be much motion blur, so it should be fine. But I was hit with another problem. When I was flying towards the sun, I got some prop flicker because there was no NDs. I've not seen that for about 7 years, but it's a thing if you're filming with a high shutter speed and pointing the camera straight at the sun. Anyway, I don't want to linger on it too much. Variable aperture is useful. This is an expensive drone at the end of the day. Obviously, they're not going to want to cannibalize the Mavic 3 series, but just giving you some information and some feedback to do with as you wish. In terms of photos, we don't have as many new developments. It's kind of business as usual, which is no bad thing. We've got a 12 megapixel sensor on both cameras. With a little bit of quad Bayer trickery, we can get 48 megapixel photos if you want that extra resolution. Both cameras shoot RAW. One of my favorite things to do is shooting panoramas. The DJI Fly app will automatically stitch together the panorama for you, export a JPEG, which is super helpful. I also do indulge from time to time in my guilty pleasure of 360 photography, which now we get the upward gimbal tilt of 60 degrees on these 2 drones. Actually, we get the whole top row of photos, so we get a full 360 photo, which is pretty cool. And if you're shooting in high dynamic range scenarios, you can take bracketed photos, 3 or 5 photos that you can blend together separately in post to really max out the dynamic range of that photo. One of the standout features of the Air 3 is its power. It can achieve the same top speed as the Mavic 3 Pro, and interestingly, a faster ascent and descent speed than the Mavic 3 Pro. Now, in the interest of science, I managed to completely overcome the Air 3 at the top of a mountain. It was flying fairly close to the ground, got pushed into the rock, crashed. You can see that I had to crouch down because there was a risk I was going to get blown off my feet. It was a bit sketchy. It was very, very, very windy up there. I think what we can learn from that is if it's too windy to stand, it's too windy to fly a drone. Nonetheless, that wouldn't have been an issue had it not been flying quite close to the ground. All of these points of interest at the top of the mountain were done in insanely windy conditions. It was horrific up there. It doesn't really look it, but it was awful. And not only could the drone fly, but it could produce some usable and fantastic footage. A creative opportunity that arises from having all that power is I've been shooting more slow motion than I've ever filmed with a drone. Now, slow motion only makes any sense if there's motion in the shot, be it motion in the subject or motion in terms of camera movement. I like to combine both. You see in these shots filmed at 100 frames per second, I am moving and the camera is moving. I've set that drone off to do a point of interest at full speed, spinning around me, and then I'm moving. If you don't get lots and lots of camera motion, it's not really going to be so interesting for your slow motion shots. You need to cover some distance. So that speed and power and the ability to do all these things in hostile conditions gives you creative opportunity. There's so many features on these drones, it's hard to cover it all in one video. The hyperlapses, very nice, very stable obviously, because we have a powerful drone here. That's a valuable thing when you're creating hyperlapses. Night mode, I didn't test it. I don't like flying at night. The one time I did it, I crashed a Mavic 2 Pro into the side of a cliff, so not in a rush to repeat that exercise. But I've heard the night mode is very good, so there's a valuable contribution on that one. We don't get true vertical shooting mode with the Air 3, unlike the mini series of drones. Doesn't matter to me personally. If I was doing a vertical shot, I'd be okay with the 2.7K crop that we can do on the Air 3. But each to their own on that one. If I've missed anything out, let's chat about it in the comments below. Check out the links in the description to the various resources, drone comparison charts, so on and so forth, free ebook. And yeah, see you next time.